Molt bona tarda a tothom i moltes gràcies per acompanyar-nos aquest vespre. Avui tenim l'honor i el plaer de donar la benvinguda a la professora Rosi Braidotti, molt coneguda per nosaltres. La Rosi Braidotti és una catedràtica de filosofia de la Universitat d'Utrecht, on va crear i encara és directora del Centre de les Humanitats. Com molts de vostès sabran, ella és una figura molt influent en els estudis de gènere i feminisme i també en el terreny de la teoria crítica i ha rebut nombrosos premis i distincions arreu del món i ha obtingut els doctorats honoris causa a diferents universitats europees. Rosi Braidotti ha vingut al CCCB per reflexionar al voltant de les qüestions que planteja la nostra exposició Humans Més, que, com sabeu, és una exposició que el que està fent és analitzar quin és l'impacte del progrés científic i dels avenços de la ciència en el cos humà i en el futur de l'espècie humana, un tema que és molt proper a la reflexió de Rosi Braidotti, i també s'emmarca en una reflexió de més llarg termini del CCCB sobre quin és el paper de les humanitats a la societat i de com en aquests moments hauríem de reinventar les humanitats en un moment en què sembla que tothom les qüestiona, en un moment que sembla que estan en crisi, com es poden replantejar les humanitats per tal que tinguin el rol que els pertoca a la societat. La conferència d'aquest vespre coincideix amb la publicació en castellà a Gedissa del seu llibre Lo posthumano, en el qual precisament ell el que fa és proposar un nou model humanístic que integri els nous avenços científics, però també incorpora les perspectives de gènere, la perspectiva postcolonial, en un intent magnífic de parlar a la vegada de política, de ciència, de cultura, d'art, en el qual ella posa exemples del menjar modificat genèticament, de les segones vides que tots tenim en l'esfera digital, de la robòtica i les tecnologies reproductives, també de la manera com tenim de fer la guerra actualment, amb els drons i altres pròtesis d'aquestes tecnològiques, i a tots els instruments tecnològics dels quals cada vegada depenem més tant a nivell individual com a nivell col·lectiu. Rosi Braidotti té la virtut de reflexionar sobre totes aquestes qüestions i vincular-les també a les migracions globals, a la diversitat cultural, a les qüestions com el canvi climàtic, que en aquests moments s'està debatent de manera tan important a París, i per tant per nosaltres és un honor i un plaer, i tenim moltíssimes ganes de sentir-la parlar de la condició posthumana. Sense més preàmbuls li cedeixo la paraula.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, and amici carissimi, buonasera. Such a joy to be here. In Barcelona, CCCB, a legendary place, a great honor to be here, and I'm already doing things wrong, excellent. A word of thanks in anticipation to my poet translator. I am Italian, so I will get faster and faster as I go. So flag me down or shoot me down, you can also do that, to calm me down. And a word of thanks to Albert, my click master, who will be operating the images. And my publisher in the audience, thank you so much for translating my book into Spanish, a world language. I'm excited and very, very honored. The posthuman is a very annoying word. The last thing we need is another post. We have had them all to the post-it condition, as Derrida put it. So I wouldn't want us to focus on the post part of the posthuman, but rather on the human part, maybe, whatever that may be. For me, the posthuman is not a concept, it is a navigational tool. It is a way of bringing into focus what is happening around us on discussions about what it means to be human. Well, that's a century-old preoccupations, but more specifically, what is the basic unit of reference to define the human today. If you look at exhibitions in the art world, media work, television series, if you're looking at the scholarship, if you're looking at the literature, concern about non-human, inhuman, posthuman, extinction, resurrection, and intergalactical travel is all over us. Recently, the president of Harvard, not the least of authorities, declared that the major question of today is our different understanding of what kind of humans we're in the process of becoming. So in the book, I try to ask myself, how did it come to this? Why is it that all of a sudden there is a kind of a panic about redefining the human? So the posthuman is a convergence exercise, a convergence between at least two major movements of idea. One is posthumanism, and the other is post-anthropocentrism. Aren't you sick of the posts already? I am, but there you go. Posthumanism, post-anthropocentrism. The adjective is the same, posthuman, but the story behind it is quite different. Posthumanism, as a student of Foucault, such as I have been in my youth, posthumanism has a long and distinguished tradition in critical theory. The generation of my teachers, Foucault, Irigaray, Deleuze, the people who come after Jean-Paul Sartre, took on the question of humanism very seriously, disagreeing not only with the liberal version of humanism, universal human rights, Kantian morality, the sort of line that is defended very nobly today by people like Martha Nussbaum, whom I respect but disagree with. Not only the liberal version, but very important for my family. I'm from an anti-fascist Italian family. Socialist humanism, Jean-Paul Sartre. The idea that socialism, that Marxism, communism even, entail a different vision of humanity, a new humanity, born again from the ashes and the horrors of capitalism. And I think it is the legacy of socialist humanism that we need to hold on to today and discuss. And in some ways, the generation of my teachers, Foucault and the others, disagreed with Sartre and Beauvoir specifically on this issue. Was the future of the revolution, was the future of radical politics, some variation on humanism, a rebirth of humanity, a radical changeover of humanity, or did we need a different type of politics? If you look at the very bitter debate, Sartre versus Foucault, Simone de Beauvoir versus Hélène Cixous and Irigaray in the 1980s, at the heart of the matter is actually how we understand humanity and a new humanity. My teachers were very skeptical of humanist assumptions about new humans and new humanity. They thought that was a trick. They were much more influenced by Nietzsche than they were by the Hegelian Marxist tradition. And I think these theories must resonate here in Spain, in Catalonia, with your complex history and your very strong tradition of a visceral, almost, left-wing humanism. So the crisis of that has very multiple facets. And to be posthumanist can actually mean that you still are a humanist, only you are more radical than Martha Nussbaum, which is not very difficult, admittedly. So it's not necessarily anti-humanist. And I think you will find more and more people today, as we know, the climate change summit is happening right now. We have millions of refugees pushing at our border. There is a sense of apocalyptic doom about everything. So a lot of people are returning to some sort of radical humanism as the last possible way out of the confusion and the pain that we're in. Well, Foucault and Deleuze teach us that we need to go through that pain, and of course, conceptually, they stand for the alternative to Hegel and Marx, and the alternative is the one and only Spinoza. It is the turn to Spinoza in the 1970s and 80s that introduces a different understanding of the human's relationship to the non-human. Spinoza is a monistic philosopher. He argues that there is one matter, intelligent and self-organized. Read with the neurosciences of today and reread with people like Deleuze and Guattari, Spinoza is the original thinker of the nature-culture continuum. He makes no difference between objects that are made by human labor and objects that are found in nature. There is no such fundamental distinction within a monistic ontology. In 1979, Pierre Macheret wrote a famous book called Hegel ou Spinoza, which about 3 people read. That book was translated into English in 2011, better late than never, at the back of the Deleuze wave. And it's a very interesting book. Have a look at it. 1979, the students of Louis Althusser looking for an alternative to what was the failure of the May 68 riots. Disenchanted with the Soviet Union and disenchanted with the United States of America, look for another politics, look for a third way, and they look toward brands of Spinozist activism as the answer. The publications speak for themselves. Early Deleuze, a couple of books in Spinoza's, late 60s, early 70s, Matterhorn, Macheret, 1970s, the first Toni Negri on Spinoza, 1970s, it's all there. But somehow the Spinozist monistic, non-kind of transcendental humanist school always remains marginal. And I think Deleuze and Guattari are the expression of that type of monistic philosophy. And if you look at the success of French theory in the United States of the last 30 years, the Americans imported everything from France except Deleuze and Guattari. Too difficult, too political. They also refused to travel, of course, certainly to the United States. They did go to Brazil. So there's a very recent discovery in the English language of these monistic philosophies, and that forces a reconsideration of the whole human, non-human debate. I could talk about Spinoza for hours, but I would not. I cannot. The post-humanism debate is around these sort of issues. The post-anthropocentrism debate is a completely different story. Post-anthropocentrism means accepting ourselves as members of a dominant, aggressive species that has ruined this planet. And you know, you can be as radical as hell. You can stand in front of the mirror and do the mantra of radicalism. I am against capitalism, yes. I am against patriarchy, yes. I am against violence. I am against profit. I am against everything. I am against my own species. Oops. A different type of utterance, a different type of statements. 2 things are at play here. Firstly, in the language of philosophy and the human social sciences, we are not used to speaking of ourselves as members of a species. Of the great thinkers of critical theory, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of modernity, according to Foucault, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and Darwin, Darwin never made it into philosophy and social sciences. We are married to social constructivist methodologies. One is not born, one becomes a woman, may have been true in 1949 when Simone de Beauvoir wrote it. That statement is scientifically very questionable today. Social constructivism as a method is over to a very large extent. People talk about post-constructivism, the return of realism, new ontologies, new materialism, the affective turn. The list of the new methods is really, really long, and you need a serious gin and tonic to go through it. If you are, gin and tonic is the drink of critical theory as far as I'm concerned. Sorry, it's a colonial drink, but I was raised in Australia. So you have this proliferation of understandings of what it means to be part of species, of an entrenched habit of constructivism that is preventing us from accessing the contemporary turn to new materialism, which is in fact a turn to monism. Post-anthropocentrism forces us to reconsider our relationship to naturalized others. And naturalized others are essential animals and plants. And animals are subdivided, according to Borges, into 3 categories: the animals that we eat, the animals that we watch television with, and the animals that we are scared of. And this mock sort of taxonomy really tells you how complex and how very codified the relationship between human and animals is. Animals in literature have spelled a sort of moral grammar of human virtues and sins. Think of Molière's fable. Think of all classical literature where the animal stands for an emanation of human qualities. How to work out of this metaphorical relationship to animals is one of the big questions of today. And the question is, why are we in the middle of a post-anthropocentric turn? And I wish I could come to you as a real serious animal rights activist, which I'm not. I am a philosopher and a cartographer of ideas. And my hypothesis as to why we have such a focus on post-anthropocentrism, such renewed attention to human, non-human relations, is because of a dual factor. The strength of our science and technology, essentially the 4 technologies that carry advanced capitalism, biogenetics, information technologies, neurosciences, and nanotechnologies, all of them dealing with living matter, with matter that life is made of. So the character of our science being biogenetic means that it deals with living matter as informational codes. It's about informational codes. We know that the Human Genome Program has been decoded and cloned, is available on internet. But our system, universities included, has decoded the informational system of almost everything that lives, plants and animals. The informational code of almost every species has been not only decrypted and copied, but to a very large extent, it has become patented. And the issue of patenting what used to be the natural order is at the core of what people call the Anthropocene, the geological era that we're in. I will give you an example. A company called Monsanto in the United States owns the genetic code of every variety of grain and seeds, so that the farmers of the world, when they want to plant wheat or rye, have to buy the seeds from Monsanto that has the patent on those lines of organism. And of course, Monsanto has genetically recombined the seeds so that they produce only for 1 year, so that the following year, the farmers have to buy it again. The systems of patenting, licensing, the informational code of all that lives is capital today. It is the biogenetic core of advanced capitalism, and the universities, including mighty Barcelona, are in the middle of it. We are the science park that produces what Melinda Cooper calls life as surplus. The capital today is the informational code that all that lives. People call this cognitive capitalism. People also call it the global obscenities because of the enormous disparities in poverty, wealth, and access to the riches of the advanced economy. Donna Haraway, instead of Anthropocene, talks about Capitalocene. The disasters of advanced capitalism is a cognitive system that deals in living matter in all that lives. Other people call it the Anthropocene. And Dana Shiva, my favorite, calls it biopiracy, stealing the actual codes of life. I give you this example to then make my Deleuzian point. Advanced capitalism being structured like this, because the political economy of advanced capitalism is life as surplus, then issues to do with materiality and the monistic interconnection of all that lives come inevitably at the center of the attention. In other words, the post-anthropocentric turn is for me a political issue. It's part of a political cartography about what counts as capital, what counts as surplus value, what the role of knowledge production is, and what we can do, we in the university, to try to issue some alternatives. This post-anthropocentric turn is actually quite a complex issue. On the one hand, the panic, on the other hand, the excitement of all the possibilities. As a scholar, I am so in love with science. I think that these are incredible times that we're living through. Too bad about the biopiracy part. Too bad about the cloning and the profiting part. But what an exciting time to be able to think about the human. So in this context, then, we are almost politically compelled to address these issues and look at them critically, looking at what kind of recomposition of the human we can come up with. And now I will give you a number of visual images, because this is all a bit abstract and we're all needing our glass of wine at this time of day. But in the global general culture, we have the panic about the future of the human, the excitement about being able to become more than human. We have Habermas writing a book called The Future of Human Nature, totally panic-stricken, saying technology is stealing humanity from us. He's always panic-stricken, Habermas. I don't know what it is. A very anxious kind of philosopher. Sloterdijk writing about rules for the human park. Fukuyama, the great conservative, not my favorite, but never mind. Again, about the future of the human. There's a real wind of panic about what's happening to the human. Incredible intervention by the Vatican, His Holiness the Pope, in his last encyclical letter on the environment, which I highly recommend, an extraordinary letter in which he goes through the environmental degradation, accusing capitalocene, advanced capitalism, of being responsible for the climate change, and yet bringing back, of course, Christian Catholic morality as the answer. But when the Vatican did the big conference, you do know who the Pope invited as the keynote speaker? Naomi Klein, left-wing feminist socialist anarchist from Toronto. You have to give it to Papa Francesco. He has his moments. So I'm secular, but you've got to give it to him. So all of this, and I think you just open the newspapers and you will have this daily in front of your eyes. Panic, fear, conservative reinscription of forms of humanism. Martha Nussbaum, give human rights to animals, give human rights to plants, we give human rights to everything, and then we can't exploit them anymore. I don't know what world she lives in, but never mind. And on the other hand, excitement. The excitement that we can become more than human. And the group that believes in this enhancement, as we call it, the enhancement of the human, is the transhumanist. And you think, what a bunch of hippies thinking that they can escape to outer space. Because it is true that the transhumanist dream does go back, as does internet, to hippie culture of the 1960s and 70s, but I have news for you. The transhumanists are located at the University of Oxford in the UK, and they run an institute, ladies and gentlemen, and the institute is called the Institute for the Future of Humanity, run by Nick Bostrom, very brilliant man, millions of funding, including from the European Commission. Bostrom just got the ERC grant, one of the most prestigious grants you can get in Europe. The project is transhumanist, super intelligence is the code word, human enhancement is the practice. Now, this should, just go and Google it. Just Google Oxford Institute for the Future of Humanity and pour the entire bottle of gin now. Not tonic, just stay with the gin, because this should just give you a glimpse of what is at stake in the recomposition of humanity today. There is a struggle around who gets to define the human, what counts as the basic unit of reference for the human. And in what follows then, I will give you a number of rather controversial and provocative alternatives from my political culture. Let's go to China first, Albert. Thank you.
Superpower, Black Energy Skill Series. Black Energy Altitude Flying. Sanitary pad skateboard. Sanitary pad skateboard flying mode. Blood cells attacked. Blockchain defense.
Cut off the sound. This goes on for 10 minutes. Shanghai-based Lu Yang. It's on internet. It's on YouTube. You can tune in. Second bottle of gin. Manga tradition, in-your-face Chinese radical feminism, appropriation of fallopian tubes and uteruses by technology, both the fear and the excitement of motherhood becoming an intergalactical force and a technologically mediated force, and all of youth culture behind it. It really rocks. Sorry for the older generation, but that's how it goes, with a very peculiar sense of humor. That's the first example. Lu Yang represented the People's Republic of China at the Venice Biennale this year. Very young artist to look out for. Let's change continent and go to the UK. disabled artist Sue Austin made the first piece for the London Olympics, and the second one followed after that. Again, you can find it all on YouTube. Two almost extreme examples: the hyper-mediated cybernetic imagination of youth culture, the uterus man, the sting, the radical feminism of that. And here, people call this the blue humanities because it's about the ocean, it's about water. The green humanities is about trees and the planet. And here, the aquatic element and a disabled person being able to design a special wheeling chair that allows her to dive and make the art that she wants to make. Real body, but traversing species divisions, cutting across the usual boundaries of what human bodies are supposed to do, showing a type of enhancement that is not mediated biogenetically or technologically a little bit, but is mostly a reaching out towards other species. These two examples are for me the two faces of how a monistic materialist ontology allows us to think about human, non-human in a post-human perspective. They're both post-human, but in very different ways. And they are reinventing human non-human interaction, enlarging our sense of possibilities. They are a relational modes of being. I think the key to the whole monistic thing is relational, to be part of what we used to call nature, which for us today is nature culture. Nature culture as one word, because our nature is completely technologically mediated. Our existence is technologically mediated. And here I'm looking at the younger generations. Do you get panic attacks if your telephone has no satellite coverage? Do you get up at 2 in the morning to check your emails? Do you manage to have email-free Fridays? Can you imagine an existence without the iPad, the iPhone, the laptop? I think not. I think if you want an understanding of nature culture, think of your relationship to your iPhones. And through the iPhones, think of the power of relation that you have in your hands. Enormous and huge, more than the Allied forces had when they landed in Normandy at the end of the Second World War. We have more informational power in one of our iPhones than they had in the totality of the Allied forces. Just think the simple enhancement that our technology gives. So you see my technophilic part emerging here, the excitement about what bodies can do, both in the real world and in the graphic world of media and design. That sense of possibility is what Deleuze calls the virtual, the ability to actually embody and enact possibilities that we had not even dreamt of. And I think our era makes actualizations of the virtual very possible. The problem is that there is a real race for recoding all of this in cognitive capitalism, in biopiracy, along the lines of what I mentioned before, a real race to appropriate it and to re-territorialize it as superintelligence, the future of humanity, human enhancement, brain-computer interfaces, a set of premises that are disembodied, disembedded, and highly elitist, highly selective. And I think it's that struggle that I call the corporate reinvention of humanity. There is a corporate reinvention of humanity going on today, corporate humanism, of which probably the most perverse expression are our humanitarian wars. If you want an oxymoron, a humanitarian war really does it. And now it's all gone into counterterrorism, so we don't even talk about those anymore. But a reinvention of the human through corporate UN military-backed operations. So my posthuman is a radical critique of reinvention of humanity that wipe out all the differences that matter. all the differences that feminism, post-colonial theory, radical science studies have spent the last decades working on. We all know in feminism, in post-colonial and radical science studies, that we are not all human in the same way to begin with. We don't belong to the category of humanity in the same way to begin with. My gender, the females of the species, had to wait a long time before our humanity was fully recognized. We were not educated until last century. Our sense of moral goodness was questioned. Millions of us were burned at the stakes as witches because we were other. Our belonging to humanity has been a long struggle, which is nothing in relation to the struggle for belonging to humanity of Black and indigenous and post-colonial populations. In Linnaeus' classification of species, the animals begin at the Africans. The cutting point between human and animals is the Africans. That's Linnaeus. Just great genius, there's no question on that. But the racialization of the human, the racialization of what counts as the human, that man, the Da Vinci man that I use as my illustration in the book, white, drop-dead, gorgeous, perfect body, he even got blonde hair. And of course, Da Vinci, whose sexuality is highly questionable, was designing him. The Vitruvian ideal, which is as much an erotic fantasy as a normative image of being human. We are not human in the same way to begin with. This means that we are not going to become post-human in the same way either. And there's going to be at the moment enormous discussion between indigenous population, environmental struggle, and capitalism to decide what kind of post-colonial, post-human we can become. What kind of post-colonial, digitized post-human we can become. There is a struggle for what we are capable of becoming. I want to give you two examples of corporate humanism, and then we can all go dancing. Corporate humanism has a long history, of course, in capitalism. And the first example I want to give you is from my youth. It's very, very cute. We're in the 1970s, if Albert is with me, and it's the ad that changed the world.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me. Harmony, harmony. I'd like to buy the world a home and keep it company.
And then come Michael Jackson with Pepsi, and it's the end of that. You can say that's the 1970s, yes, but then come the 1990s. And we have the genius of corporate humanism, not because he's Italian from my region, not at all, but because the Benetton ad campaign about corporate humanity really marked an era. Daring, extraordinary. The message couldn't be clearer. We are in this together. The blonde beauty, the ambiguous Black, and in case there is any doubt of where the future is, Buddha in the middle saying, yeah. Fantastic. Benetton, the first firm to open shops in China way, way back in the 80s. One humanity under the cover of consumer spending capitalism, sharing values, and the values that we share is humanism. It gets worse. The reconciliation without a serious discussion of what this image evokes. You could run this by your students, and if they've done no race or post-colonial studies, they wouldn't even get the reference to the Black nannies, to the whole history of Black on white bodies. quick, hasty, superficial reconciliations that actually erase the enormous power issue, the pain and the complexity of historically dense power situations. God, what can I say? Give me a gin and tonic, that's all I can say. And then only one race, the human race. And I think that's the last one, correct, Albert? Yeah, we can leave that just for fun. And I think that the platitudes about we are in this together, only one race, the human race, the new humanity, are for me as a posthumanist, as an anti-humanist, as a student of Foucault and Deleuze, are very dangerous signals. They signal both the erasure of power difference and a very perverse, opportunistic reintroduction of fake humanist values, because you cannot want human enhancement through interface of brain, computers, analytic philosophy, and clinical psychology to take the Oxford equation. You cannot want all of that and then reintroduce as the only ethical system Kantian universal morality. That is cheating humanity out of our own future. So my fear, and that's why I wrote the posthuman, is that we are opening enormous possibilities and then shutting the same door down. And I think what will be achieved in Paris now has already been announced as 20 billion to be spent in research, money for the universities to come up with the prototypes to save humanity from the Anthropocenic destruction. So there will be more knowledge production, more cognitive investment, and no real questioning of what the ethical values is. Neo-Spinozist monism, understanding that yes, we are in this together because we are made of the same matter. And the matter that we're made of goes through modulation and variations. So we are part of this, but not in any simplistic rhetorical manner. We are ecosophically part of this. We are embedded, embodied, affective, relationally part of this. And to go back to the example of the two artists that I gave you, the spectacular Ling Yang and the much more humble in some ways, but equally daring, Sue Austin, we have the spectacular and the less spectacular. And that reminds me of my favorite sentence in the English language, which is from George Eliot's novel, Middlemarch. George Eliot says that if we had our eyes and heart open, we would be able to hear the roar that lies on the other side of silence, the roar that lies on the other side of silence. But we would also be able to hear the beating of a squirrel's heart. As it is, we walk around wrapped in stupidity. George Eliot, Mary Evans, in case if you don't know, a great woman who wrote under a male pseudonym. And why do I mention her? Because George Eliot is the English translator of Spinoza. And if you have read Middlemarch or The Mill on the Floss, you are in a world where everything holds together, but it is because of ethical relationality, not because of corporate sponsorship. It's because of a deep sense of multiple belongings and the stubborn determination that yes, we can make it, but it's going to be hard work, and we are not going to be helping this cause by wiping out all differences. We have to work through the difference out to multiple ways of becoming posthuman, multiple rhizomic, probably contradictory, but not a one-way road, not for this humanity at this particular point in time. Spectacular and imperceptible, we are in this together, but we is a people that needs to be composed. It's a community that needs to be created. And creating a community is the ultimate ethical gesture. Plane of composition, says my teacher, Deleuze. The conatus, the desire to hold together, says the great heretical Spinoza. And I think this would be the road to a livable, sustainable posthuman. That's the hope that sustains my work. And if you think that this is very humanistic, you're probably right. you. I have to take the thing, right?
Moltes gràcies per aquesta magnífica conferència i aquest estímul a pensar el posthumanisme de manera diferent. Obrim ara un torn de preguntes i de qüestions amb vosaltres. Qui tingui ganes de fer la primera pregunta.
En primer lloc, moltes gràcies per la conferència que ens ha fet. Ha estat suggerent, no, el següent. Però sí que hi ha una qüestió que jo voldria saber...
Un segon que no funciona, no?
Just need to get the translation.
Don't worry, I can wait. Hola?
Yeah, got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Una qüestió que a mi m'agradaria preguntar-li és que com que sé que en Deleuze no es mirava amb gaire bons ulls la psicoanàlisi, diguem que era algú que tenia certes antipaties, tot i així hi ha una qüestió que diguem des de la psicoanàlisi també podem compartir amb el diagnòstic que vostè fa, i és que el capitalisme contemporani el que vol eliminar és el que lacanianament s'anomena com el símptoma, és a dir, com la dimensió del real, com allò impossible de simbolitzar que ateny a la sexualitat i a la mort del subjecte, cada subjecte s'hi relaciona com pot i com sap. I des d'aquí a mi m'agradaria saber si vostè considera que la psicoanàlisi pot jugar un paper interessant en el que ens proposa de repensar, diguem, un subjecte en què el règim binari no és l'únic que pot existir. Gràcies. Okay.
We'll collect 2 or 3 questions. Aquí hi ha una altra pregunta, no? La pot fer en català, castellà o anglès directament?
No, vull dir, ja faig la pregunta, no esperem la... D'acord, d'acord. A veure, estem coincidint ara en l'espai i en el temps, aquí en el planeta, doncs els humans, els posthumans, alguns prehomínids, alguns cíborgs i també els robots. Llavors, hem de partir... Jo penso, jo soc filòloga, i llavors jo estic mirant que el llenguatge, encara gairebé totes les llengües del món, gairebé totes les llengües humanes, són antropocèntriques. Vull dir que fan servir la persona o bé el que parla o bé el que escolta com a punt de referència. Gira a la dreta, gira a l'esquerra, ens fem servir a nosaltres. Em sembla que la llengua dels aborígens australians és una de les poques que és geocèntrica, vull dir, ves cap al nord, ves cap al sud. Llavors, si hem de conviure encara ara més, no hauríem de... No sé si això s'està debatent en algun lloc perquè a mi m'interessa molt, però és que la frase, el parlar, fa el pensament. Llavors una mica també s'hauria de redefinir i de mirar com ens comportarem i com parlarem amb les noves tecnologies i amb els nous humans i posthumans que arribaran. No sé, si això s'està parlant i debatent en algun lloc, a mi m'interessa moltíssim saber-ho. I moltes gràcies per ser aquí.
Gràcies.
I feel very cybernetic with this thing, but I better take it off while I speak. Thank you so much. There are 2 connected questions, language and psychoanalysis, of course. One of the distressing things about the new interest in Deleuze, when I look at my students, is that because they read the Anti-Oedipus and they think that Deleuze and Guattari are saying that psychoanalysis is all wrong, they just don't read a word of psychoanalysis. And I think that is methodologically totally wrong. If you want to be seriously against something, you better know your enemy and do some work. And not be so silly as to think, oh, I don't need to go there. So my generation was trained seriously in psychoanalysis. It was part of a philosophical training at the Sorbonne
in the 1980s. I did my duty for 7 years and 3 times a week because that's what you did if you were going to work on issues of desire, difference, and body. You were not allowed to talk about those issues and not have any psychoanalytic understanding because you would end up being completely nonsensical. And even today, actually, I can pick from the writings, when people write on psychoanalysis, I can almost always guess if they have actually done an analysis or not. It's subtle. Sometimes I can even pick at what particular point a certain thinker goes into analysis, because it actually, the theoretical text changed considerably. So I would advise, for instance, Freud, 4 case histories has to be read. For the younger generation out there that thinks that psychoanalysis is like the cathedrals of the 14th century, 13th century, Freud's case studies, the 4 case studies, fundamental. It's so much fun as well. It reads like a novel of traumatized neurotics, and you will recognize part of yourself in it. So I would plead for Freud. I would have a very different take on Lacan. And then we go to the question of the linguistic turn. Sorry, this gets a little bit technical, so if you want to do your emails now, you can. This is the moment. The linguistic turn, the Lacanian intervention about the unconscious being structured like language, the logistics of metaphor and metonymy, and the type of political economy here, where power is positioned so firmly in a master signifier that we will call phallologocentrism. If you can pronounce it, you already passed half of your exams. So the idea that there is one matrix of power, I would say that's the problem with the Lacanian thing. One matrix of power, phallologocentrism. And you have exactly the same problem with Irigaray. She believes the same thing. Judy Butler believes the same thing. And I think if you're coming in from a nomadology, from Deleuze and Guattari, that is to say with Spinozist politics, there is never only one. It's always a multitude of mechanisms of capture, a multitude of centers of power, scattered hegemonies, and not single locations of power. So I think this fixation on the master signifier, which has to do with Lacan's interpretation of Saussure, is what we need to question again. In other words, and now I can bridge the 2 questions, the problem here is what kind of linguistic theory we use, not whether language matters or not, but what kind of linguistics theory do we use. Deleuze and Guattari essentially reject Saussure. They don't reject linguistics, and of course they don't reject language. It's nonsense. Language is our medium, as what we speak in. But the Saussurean interpretation of language is very specific. The differential, cross-referring, etc. That is what is being criticized. In 1000 Plateaux, which is the best philosophy book of the second half of the 20th century, you can quote me anytime, there is a whole chapter on linguistics. But it is not on structural linguistics. It is on performative linguistics. It is on even pre-communicative linguistics. It is about preverbal linguistics. So I think is which linguistic system does justice to the language that we speak today. And here I go back to the question of codes. If it is the case in cognitive capitalism that we are mediated, and that we live on screen, that we live through information technologies, if it is the case that the capital in our culture is genetic codes, and if we are in a code system, then what is the status of the linguistic sign in a code system? Because this is science versus codes here. And you can do this very sociologically, very pragmatically. I'm appealing to the young generation here with your social networks and your SMSs and MSSs. I've looked at some of those messages from my students. That was not a human language. That was not human grammar. That was not human punctuation. Whatever that was, it was a code system. Not different from birds cooing to each other and the kind of sounds that animals make in pre-linguistic communication. Extraordinary. And the reason why you can be so fast, you little thugs, is because you don't speak a human language. God knows what you're speaking. So I think that is, and this is showing across now primary and secondary schools as laptops become what our children learn from. They don't have books anymore. As the laptop becomes your first textbook, the other thing that is happening, and this has now been officialized in Finland, is the children don't learn to handwrite anymore. Handwriting is finished. It's not compulsory in the Finnish system, it's not compulsory in the Dutch system, it's not compulsory in the Australian school system. You can print. You can just write like this. You don't need the cursive handwriting anymore. Michel Serres, in his wonderful book called La Petite Poussette, Thumbelina, which you have translated, what a great publisher I have. Buy from Gediza, discounted. Michel Serres talks about the neurological implication of the fact that our children are now beginning to swoosh everything. They touch the table, it's not interactive. What kind of an object is this? They swoosh. They expect the interactivity to be everywhere. Their brains, argues Serres, are being wired differently. They will speak a different language. And language apparently is not my field, but language has undergone such mutations in other moments of our history. This is a major one. And I think what the consequences of this will be remains to be seen. But you may have noticed I am, first of all, a pathological optimist. And secondly, very excited about the possibilities that the technologies open up. So I would be for running the experiment, but it may be that we are in a culture of codes and not of signs. A final annotation, because I speak too much. In the big university colleges in the United States, NYU and Harvard, if you study cultural studies and the humanities, it is now compulsory to have a course in computer programming, algorithms, codes, programming, the new Latin. If you want to understand what's happening, you've got to understand how this stuff works. And it's not difficult to have an introductory course. I may do one after I retire. But algorithmic culture, and people call it the computational turn, where the humanities still remain the humanities, but there will be digital humanities. And again, the implications of this great challenge for pedagogy. We need to bring back pedagogy to the university curriculum, I think.
Hi ha una pregunta allà al fons. No, there's over there. Sí, podríeu baixar una miqueta les llums, sisplau, que ens enlluernem una miqueta?
Hi. In your discussion of corporate humanism, you spoke about. Sorry, here I am. Sorry. You spoke about opportunistic usage of fake humanist values, and I was wondering if you could qualify that sentence a bit. I totally agree with you. When I see campaigns like that, they kind of make me want to vomit, but I can't really explain why. If they are using these humanist values to make a profit, are those humanist values then fake somehow? Anyway, I was wondering if you could explain a bit. Thank you.
This is what I call a great research question. I'd love to see your research on this, so if anybody is looking for an MA topic, please take it up. I'm not so cynical as to think that it's only about profit. A lot is about profit, clearly, the Benetton, but today you'll find the same in Shell, any company, they're always selling humanity. They used to sell sex, that was more fun. Now they sell humanity. It's a really interesting turn that's going on. The counterexample that I would have is, of course, the sense of corporate ethics, but also a sincere concern for what is happening. You may know that one of the great campaigners against inequality and economic inequality and poverty in the world today is Christine Lagarde. Christine Lagarde, president of the IMF, president of the World Economic Forum. Just look at her declarations for the last 2 years, systematic, very worried about economic inequalities, disparities. Why? Because they create social unrest, revolutions, Podemos, Syrizas, them radicals, biting at the gates of a capitalist fortress. There is, of course, the opportunism. There is sincere concern. It is never either or. I am a Deleuzian. It's and. It's bits of this and bits of that. I have noticed of late, however, that the corporate world is really putting it on with this human concern. The example I have for this is a very sort of dodgy character by the name of Arianna Huffington, who runs the Huffington Post, the biggest blog in the world. 900 unpaid bloggers make the Huffington Post work. And Arianna Huffington started her career as Arianna Stassinopoulos, and she wrote the famous pamphlet against Germaine Greer, before Germaine Greer went mad on the trans issue. In the early days, a pamphlet against the female eunuch called The Female Woman. And that was the beginning of Arianna Stassinopoulos, then become Arianna Huffington. Arianna Huffington is concerned about anxiety, stress, and suicide rates. So what is her answer? Are you sitting down? Mindfulness. We all should go and collectively meditate. Corporate Buddhism and corporate mindfulness. And then it gets, at this point, it gets really irritating, and you start wondering. And somebody who does not employ 900 unpaid bloggers and preaches mindfulness. It's those contradictions. His Holiness the Pope, with his incredible letter, and then bringing back natural law, Thomas Aquinas, and bringing back the dogma, but also opening up. I think it's a moment where you have this oscillation, this and. I would like the more progressive, we used to be called radicals, those were the days, and we're about as radical as an after dinner mint right now, but the progressive political forces to actually experiment with our ways of making this work. What would be a posthuman humanity still united by something around certain projects, not around profit, for something that we may call posthuman democracy, and let's not even call it posthuman, let's just call it something else, experimenting with the language that we need. We really need to invent new terms. We need conceptual creativity. I only know one national research council, the Swedish Research Council, that gave money for fundamental seminars about terminology and language, which is how Deleuze ever actually defined philosophy, the creation of new concepts. But the creation of new concepts requires language. And this is why the artist at the moment, anybody who has an artistic practice, is so important, because you're experimenting with intensities in a way that we really cannot easily in the academic world, because we're working with language, with a tired out old language. So we would need fundamental humanities laboratories about language and terminology. And that would be my vision of the Faculty of the Humanities in the 21st century. That's what I would do if they voted me rector, but I don't think that's very likely, somehow.
Aquí, sisplau. Hi ha alguna altra pregunta que les agruparíem?
Hi, Rosi. Thanks for your talk. I think it was very stimulating for all of us. I wanted to ask you about what would be the contribution of the concept of the bare life, of Agamben's bare life, against biopolitics or necropolitics and thanatopolitics in, as a tool to analyze or as a contribution to the posthuman predicament.
Thank you. I don't know if you've seen my wonderful book published by Gediza, but chapter 3 is about this. Chapter 3 of the book is called The Inhuman, and it is all about pain and suffering and the dark side of this, the emotional side of this. But just as a boring historical reminder, in Spinoza's Ethics, there is an entire chapter about pain and death and sickness and decay and poison and human evil. I mean, Spinoza lived through terrible times. He lived through the end of the Dutch Republic. He witnessed political assassinations. He witnessed turmoil. He knew that the Enlightenment was coming, but it was still a long way off. So very similar to us. We're in the 17th century right now. We don't see the new yet, but it's kind of on the horizon. So the issue has always been there. And I'm saying this because one of the classical criticisms of Spinoza's Deleuzian monistic philosophies is that because they're monistic and they have an essentially optimistic vision of the human being, in a Spinozist Deleuzian perspective, the human is desire to exist. It's the desire to pursue your existence, conatus, the desire to go on being, fundamentally positive. We are miles away from the negative vision of the humans that you get in Hobbes and Locke, where humans are wolves in nature and we need the state to put order into this. For Spinoza, it's exactly the opposite. We're doing really fine in our own communities. The problem is the state comes in, creating turmoil. And this is, of course, where Toni Negri gets his multitudes from. And Deleuze has variations on this. So I think the standard criticism of this is that because it is so positive, and that's Hegel's criticism of Spinoza, because it is so positive, it's silly. It doesn't give us a serious politics. Are you saying that the political consists in constituting communities that work together for micro-political aims for a specific project, and when that project is done, they move on? Or they can run different projects concurrently, because this is not the Communist Party going to storm the Winter Palace. This is the everyday pursuit of the politics of affirmation, injecting countercodes and injecting antidotes into this sick system that we're in. And so the standard objection is today the objections that Badiou and that fool of Zizek have on Deleuze, that he's just being optimistic. It's the cult of negativity versus the philosophy of affirmation. I think that is really, for me, the bottom line. And I don't do a lot with affirmation in this book, but I have a couple of other books where the politics of joy and affirmation are very central to this. But to come to your question, Agamben is a very interesting thinker, and he makes his own kind of cocktail, but it doesn't look like anybody else because it is his own cocktail. I think he mixes a bit of Foucault with a bit of Hannah Arendt and then shakes it in with the legal thinker of the Third Reich, which is Carl Schmitt. Why the left has to go to Carl Schmitt is something that somebody has to explain to me someday. Why we are so poor in ideas that we have to go to the Nazi thinkers to be inspired is beyond me and beyond me. But you see the anti-fascist Italian family coming up, and the viscerality of no passaran, it's just there. So that part of Agamben is strange. It is absolutely true that Foucault, who had a lot of great one-lines and didn't do his homework, he didn't finish his books, but he died very young. Foucault has, in one moment in the first volume, I think, of the History of Sexuality, a passage where he says, biopolitics is not only about who is allowed to live, biopolitics is also about the management, who is left to die. And the term that he uses is thanatopolitics. So if you Google thanatopolitics, from Thanatos, again, psychoanalysis and a bit of Greek, you will get it. Of course, Foucault doesn't finish his work, so we don't get the book that would have done this. So what happens after this is that people go berserk on the biopolitical, and you get a whole school of biopolitics Paul Rabinow, Nick Rose, very, very mainstream. It is almost a residually Kantian approach to Foucault. And they take him into really liberal thinking. And that is very distressing, because Foucault was a man of the left and far more radical than that. He was not going to go towards an apology of the management of life in advanced capitalism. And he was going to do the opposite, in fact. So back to Agamben, he takes that sentence of Foucault and then runs with it in what is essentially a Heideggerian understanding of death as the horizon towards which we move. Again, the power of the negative. And I think I have to return to my Spinoza saying that death is the unthinkable. The death always comes from the outside, but death is part of the deal. And in a monistic system, well, the specific slice of life that you are dies. But guess what? Life goes on. You're not that important. And I think that debunking of the glorious individual self in what is a fundamentally collectivist understanding of the subject, which is Guattari, even more than Deleuze, reading Spinoza is where the politics of this is. And with Agamben, we don't get that at all. We get the negativity, we get the condemnation of modernity, we get a culture of melancholia, death, and depression. We open the chapter Melancholia here. So very interesting in himself, but not a reliable scholar if you're trying to even get to Foucault. Foucault was not arguing for the biopolitical. There's a wonderful book on the biopolitics by this German guy called Lemke. He does a very good overview. My favorite, I've already mentioned her, is Melinda Cooper, Life as Surplus, working out of Sydney, lots of money for PhDs if you're looking for places, and great cutting-edge work on the management of life and death in cognitive capitalism, which puts university professors in a really difficult position because we are in the middle of it. We are in the thick of it. We are agents of cognitive capitalism while being critical of it. So, schizophrenia, okay.
Hi havia una pregunta aquí davant.
Thanks so much for the conference. It was very interesting. And I would like to talk about the antidotes. No? You talked about intellectual property, and right now you're referring again. But we see these emerging commons, kind of collective things we're doing together, Wikipedia, open knowledge, scientific research, which is published on open, design, open software, open hardware. We're kind of creating collective capital. So it's not so much human rights one by one, but our new capacity to create capital, which is available to anyone at any time.
Yes, completely. The movement around the commons is very diversified. It goes from Hart and Negri to more traditional ways of doing this. On internet, at the moment, it seems what I read and what I see from people working on new media, the situation after Snowden is complicated. And they tell me there is a post-Snowden turn in media studies, and almost everything is about security, algorithmic security, whether it is encryption, whether it is surveillance, whether it is leaking, and there is definitely a turn towards security studies in relation to these issues. I've seen a white paper by the European Science Foundation called Humanities, Social Sciences, the relevance of security studies. And basically they go through all the disciplines of the humanities and they say, if you just twist it like this, it's really good for counterterrorism. Anthropology, they teach us how those barbarians work. Great. And then we can enlist that knowledge to the struggle against terrorism. And so on and so forth. In the European Commission Horizon 2020, the money for humanities and social sciences comes under security. The bulk of the money for research in humanism comes under security. So just reflect on this for a moment of what it means. But yes, experimenting with transversal alliance on different modes of ownership, absolutely. In some ways, Deleuze and Guattari is very similar to Lord Dahrendorf, in the sense that they're saying that capitalism is a very bad interpretation of the market economy. There are better ways of doing a market economy than capitalism. So I think that would be the line here, and that's why I'm very critical of neo-Leninist and returning to communism and all the failed experiments of the 20th century. Forward we must go, reinventing new ways of doing the market economy. And here, the transnational justice movement, the indigenous population, First Nation people fighting for water and for their land. Here they're showing the way, different modes of ownership. In Canada, in British Columbia, in Australia, you get a different approach to the notion of owning the land. And of course, post-colonial in some way. Yes, different market economies. And this one really has to be put to rest as a totally failed experiment. But they will rather lead us to the Anthropocenic disaster than give up, I'm pretty sure.
Hi ha una altra pregunta aquí. No, primer al mig de la fila, sisplau, i després aquí. I haurem d'anar acabant aviat, o sigui que qui tingui preguntes...
Well, since I am an economist, first I want to say thank you for such a talk.
Translated from English to English.
And since I am an economist, what I'm going to say has to do with the importance of how we're going to go beyond the current economy, beyond capitalism, to build the post-human order. It's in the same way that linguistics might be very, very important. Economics is going to be extremely important. How we're going to shape an economy beyond, let's say, appropriation of value, beyond exploitation, beyond inequality, whether we talk about gender inequality or racial inequality, whatever. This is going to be basic. And of course, yes, we could have a socialist market economy.
Sure. Do you have your favorite answer?
I work on the solidarity economy, which is sort of moving along very slowly. But I think many people connect to that idea.
There are very different experiments with this, from the commons, the transnational land justice movements that I mentioned before, to different pacifist movement, but also in the universities, different relationship to patenting. You know, if we just look at our own practices and the idea that actually we patent lines of biochemistry, of biogenetics, or of codes, of media code, that the universities should be producing that type of surplus value. Maybe we could start from there. And the same universities which in a neoliberal governance are killing the humanities, cutting us down as being non-profitable. So we can really take the struggle in a very Foucauldian way, right where we live, and say you can't do this. If you do this, you're turning the university into a factory of patents. And is this what we're supposed to be? Whatever happened to democratic criticism and all the things that we're trying to teach the rest of the world. I don't know what you think of Saskia Sassen's work, but I always admire her tremendously, partly because she's incredibly vital and vibrant and terribly funny. But her book, Expulsions, that shows that there is so much money going around in this moment of our economy that people are buying up land. Land acquisition has increased like 220%. From having a second home in Spain, which all of Holland does, to the Chinese in Africa, the Japanese in Australia. People are buying up the land to an unprecedented degree. And I don't know what it means, and Saskia has her own hypothesis about this, but it's a really interesting sign. It's very, very material for this virtual sort of global economy. And the Chinese intervention in Africa is also changing the shape of Africa, African higher education. The African university system is in complete turmoil and moving from the British colonial to something other. It is very exciting if you're following the sort of toppling of Cecil Rhodes statues. Have you been following what's happening in South Africa? Do you know who Cecil Rhodes is? The great colonizing power, the man of the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme. Well, campus after campus, the students are pulling down his statues. Never happened before in the Africa. So the hypothesis there is a new model of market economy with Chinese capital intervening in the traditional market economy of Africa. My African friends told me, I just did not know, that their mobile phone operating system are Chinese. They're not using Google, they're not using our Intel, they're using completely different systems for security reasons. This is the post-Snowden world. So we can't even actually communicate at that level. So I think there are multiple facets to this, but I would say economics is one of the areas where we need more allies. So if you guys don't know what to study, please go into economics and then be very radical and explain to us the real patterns of what the real economy is doing as opposed to the financial economy, which is building up debt. And so there's the financial economy and then the real economy where people are buying up land at unprecedented degrees. And I think even here we have an example of capitalism as true schizophrenia and totally dematerialized and totally grounded at the same time. A lot of work to be done here. So we count on your students to pursue it.
Aquí hi havia una pregunta, no sé si encara hi és, i allà n'hi ha una segona, les agruparem i seran les últimes. Aquí davant.
A mi amb tot això, gràcies per la xerrada, i a mi amb tota aquesta condició posthumana, on és el cos? O sigui, estem parlant de llegir nous signes, estem parlant de llegir noves llenguatges, però i el que tinc al costat com el llegeixo? El llegiré, el deixo estar, el cos no m'interessa. O sigui, cada cop estem deixant més, som humans perquè tenim un cos i no n'hem parlat gens ni mica.
We'll collect the second one. Sisplau, l'altra... Podeu passar el micro al darrere? Si pots aixecar el braç, sisplau.
Sí, hola, bona tarda. La meva pregunta va dirigida... Bueno, la qüestió per mi és si evolutivament el món que tenim, el món humà que tenim, prové i és dirigit per homes, per el sexe masculí, una forma una mena de domini, capital... Sembla que conforma una mica tot el que és l'ideari actual, el passat i el present. Creu que en el futur tindrem un futur més femení, més comunicatiu, gràcies a les noves tecnologies? Veiem alguna de llum per aquí?
The two questions again echo each other. Thank you both very much for it. I did talk about the body, but my term is embodiment. Embedded and embodied is how I call it, because the body is too close to the Cartesian body-mind distinction. So in my work I try to avoid the body, talk about embodiment, but now it's become like a mantra, embodied, embedded, affective, relational, which is a way of defining a subject that is always a compound. So it's a very, very good question. What about the bodies around us? How do we relate? And I think you can make that a sociological question, an ethical question, a political one. Politically, I gave you two examples. Lou Yang and Sue Austin are two very opposite ways of dealing with the body at this particular point in time. Disability studies at the moment is an incredibly interesting area of work. One of the most exciting in the radical studies areas, far more exciting than gender studies. That on the edge, what kind of bodies are we capable of becoming? And what can a body do with prosthetics, with extension, with goodwill, with technology, with cheerfulness? This experimenting with the bodies is what Deleuze and Guattari call bodies without organs, which mean bodies without organization. mediation, reorganizing our bodily capacities. So in our working life now, our relationship to the bodies in the office next to ours consists in sending an email that says, shall we go for coffee? Do you recognize this? So I would say that our relationship to the embodied people that we work with is mediated. Bodies equal mediation. Mediation, linguistic mediation, well, we knew that already from psychoanalysis and semiotic, but technological mediation, and then the multiple mediations that our system makes possible for us. Are you the sort of body that belongs to planet yoga? Are you a vegan inhabitant? Do you follow the witches movements? Do you know that there is a big witch movement in the United States? The biggest living witch is called Starhawk, and she has 2.5 million followers. Where did we go wrong? Isabel Stengers told me this, because she loves Starhawks. So bodies, multitudes of bodies that we would recognize by having affinities and affective modes of apprehension. So there is a definite affective turn. And in youth culture, it's very simple. People gravitate around their Facebook pages, they eat the same food, they go to the same gym, they listen to the same music, and they wear similar clothes. It's very, very coded. And you may say that those are bodies that gravitate around certain forms of identity consumption. Identity is just an excuse to go shopping, in case you hadn't read your Deleuze and your Foucault. That's why we're not very in favor of identity politics. So multiple bodies reorganizing themselves, great experimentations. And what is fantastic about the posthuman turn is that bodies are not reduced just to their gender or their sexuality. The much broader understanding of what bodies can do. Some bodies can go underwater on a wheelchair, for Christ's sake. Some bodies can run 100 meters in whatever, I can't even know how fast they run, it's so ridiculously fast. So being able to be embodied otherwise and embodied differently, I think that even with some enhancement, and in some ways, some forms of enhancement, whether it is tattooing or a little bit of silicone, oh come on, a little bit of Botox, on an everyday level, that is now some form of enhancement, is now self-improvement is very much part of our culture. So bodies are very much on the move, and God knows what they will become. But maybe we should stop sending SMSs and just turn around and talk to each other. Is the future female? Of course. It's the title of a great book, actually, an anthropology book from the 1980s, Is the Future Female? When you were asking that question, I had an association that comes from primatology, from studying the great apes, because my very dear colleague, Frans de Waal, who works at Emory, has just returned to Utrecht. And I don't know if you know Frans de Waal, W-A-A-L, one of those Dutch names with too much of everything, sort of Waal. Frans works on what would normally be chimpanzee, the theory of evolution, and we've based our entire theory of evolution on studying chimpanzees. And the chimps are very aggressive, violent, male-dominated communities that exercise power through rape and murder in the very well celebrated patriarchal formula. And they've always been the model of studying evolution, survival of the fittest, blah, blah, blah. Well, Frans de Waal changed the population, and he went to study the bonobos. And the bonobos have become megastars. There are even movies about the bonobos. The bonobos are matriarchal societies run by women. And when there are conflicts, which never fail to arise in any community, how do the bonobos resolve their conflict? By having extra-communal sex. It's like an old hippie community. Orgies, and you see in the films, just Google bonobos, and you see these films where somebody's being very grumpy, and the female takes him and they go off. Extraordinary stuff. Frans de Waal is a very respected professor. He has been named by Time magazine one of the 100 most important scientists of the century. And what he does on the basis of that, he says, but why have we based our theory of evolution on the chimpanzee when we have other primate populations that point out a totally different pattern of evolution, where sex and eroticism are used as the binding force? Freud would love this. Where there is a strong presence of the female and the male really is used for insemination, and he can just go off, he's done his duty. Just a little aside, bees function the same way. Very highly evolved social system of bees is also matriarchal. So there are interesting areas of study here. I wouldn't want to be too simple about this. And also, as a Deleuzian, I like all the degrees in between, not just male and female, but any degrees of variation of trans. And I love human diversity and sexual diversity. So I wouldn't just want to say female, whatever that is, but certainly diversifying our understanding. And again, having a notion of evolution as collaboration, sharing, actually co-working as opposed to competing. Now, there's a model for the university. I want a university that looks like the bonobos. Well, we forget the orgies part, but for the rest we should.
Moltíssimes gràcies per aquesta fantàstica conferència, per el seu temps. Moltes gràcies avui especialment a l'intèrpret, gràcies també a vosaltres per haver vingut i recordem que demà tenim una sessió sobre intel·ligència artificial que esteu tots convidats. Gràcies.